The stagecoach, aptly named the Iron Coffin by the locals, didn't so much arrive as surrender to the dust storm at the Hell's Gate crossing. A final, desperate lurch tore the axle from its carriage bed, sending the worn leather and splinter wood tumbling into the orange-red terror that had swallowed the afternoon sun. Jessamine landed hard, the wind a roaring demon in her ears, the alkali dust stinging her eyes like powdered glass. She wasn't built for fainting. She was built for surviving. A compact woman whose worn dress and scarred leather gloves spoke of necessity, not fashion. Her immediate, frantic concern was not for a bruised hip, but for the small, heavy satchel that contained every saved penny she possessed. As she scrambled blindly through the swirling grit, her fingers closed around a familiar, rough canvas just as the sound of a distant, agonized human plea was abruptly silenced, replaced by the rhythmic, purposeful thud of horses receding into the maelstrom. The men who caused the wreck were gone, leaving her alone with the screaming atmosphere and the cold truth that she was now adrift 100 miles from anywhere, and yet, somehow, closer to her destination than ever before. Her gaze, when she finally cleared the dust from her lashes, was not one of panic, but of flinty, desperate resolve. She gripped a jagged piece of stagecoach scrap iron, a makeshift cudgel, a silent promise to the brutal landscape that she would not be one of its forgotten bones. Her path led west, a grueling, solitary trek across a land of brutal silences. This was Tumbleweed Ridge, a place of desiccated scrub and stoic sandstone formations, where the sky was not blue but a vast, crushing dome of pale, indifferent heat. She had chosen this remote post precisely for its desolation, seeking a place where her past, which she guarded like a sickness, could find no purchase. Her purpose was simple, stripped bare of all romantic notion. Work, hoard, and vanish. She was seeking refuge, not a home. Finally, as the sun bled out over the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson and violet, she saw it, a single, flickering lamp burning in the heart of the immensity, the Whispering Pines Ranch. It was massive, a hulking monument of fieldstone and timber, yet it held a palpable, chilling atmosphere of neglect and decay. It looked less like a ranch and more like a mausoleum for forgotten ambition. She found the kitchen, a cavernous space where the air hung heavy and stale. Standing beneath a single, soot-stained oil lamp was the man who owned it. Caleb was a silhouette of formidable breadth and height, his clothes heavy with the smell of sweat, saddle leather, and honest effort. He was bent over a rough-hewn table, struggling with grim, practiced efficiency to break down a carcass. His silence was not rude. It was absolute, a wall of grief-etched solitude. He was wealthy only in the impossible scope of his land and the herd he wrestled from it. When Jessamine cleared her throat, the small noise was an offense in the vast room. He straightened slowly, his eyes, deep-set and devoid of light, finally meeting hers. They were the eyes of a man who had watched the essential part of his life blow away in the dust. "The agency sent me. I'm the cook," she stated, her voice surprisingly steady, a small, bright beacon of professionalism against the darkness. Caleb merely grunted, a sound of exhausted, non-committal acknowledgement. "Don't bother me," he muttered, turning back to his bloody work. The transaction was complete, the contract sealed not with paper, but with the shared, crushing weight of their mutual exhaustion. Sympathy was built instantly, not through kindness, but through the stark recognition of their matching resilience. She, desperate for sanctuary. He, desperately alone on his self-made island. The subsequent weeks were an exercise in mutual isolation. Caleb lived his days in the saddle, driving his small crew, returning only to collapse into silence. Jessamine lived in the kitchen, a world she quickly dominated. She brought a civilized, persistent warmth to the cold stone, the smell of fresh yeast, simmering beef stew, and wood smoke replacing the oppressive dampness. Her cooking was real. It was an act of quiet defiance against the ranch's prevailing air of despair. Caleb refused to eat at the large, formal dining table, a place clearly haunted by happier memories. Instead, he would take his portion and eat standing in the pantry, his back turned. Jessamine never commented. She simply left the plate of the evening meal, always covered with a clean white cloth, resting squarely in the center of the main table. It was a small, persistent battle of wills, a quiet assertion of order. The next morning, The plate was always empty, but the war remained drawn. This fragile truce was shattered one dry, windy afternoon. While filling the water trough, Jessamine noticed a deliberate carving etched into the base of a massive cottonwood. 3 sharp lines crossing a simple circle. It was not a familiar ranch mark, but a sign, a threat. A coil of cold dread tightened in her chest. She had come to the middle of nowhere to find anonymity, not danger. She hid her fear, pretending the carving was meaningless. But she knew better. This ranch was not just isolated. It was a target. She spent that evening cleaning and loading the antiquated double-barrel shotgun. She found Dusty in the pantry, the sound of the shell sliding into the breech a shocking crack in a house of silence. The next morning, the danger became real. A small cluster of calves was missing, and the ranch hands were whispering the name of a notorious outfit, the Rattlesnake Gang. Caleb was gone before dawn with the other men, grim-faced and silent. She was left alone with the echoes of his departure. He returned 3 days later, not triumphant, but a wreck. He was pitched forward in the saddle, barely conscious, a darkening stain of blood blooming across the shoulder of his canvas coat. He fell from his horse near the porch steps, a heavy, silent heap of wounded manhood. Jessamine's fear immediately transformed into focused, practical action. There was no time for panic, only necessity. She ordered the remaining hands to secure the gates, then dragged Caleb into the vast, echoing kitchen. The wound was a raw, angry groove from a bullet graze. She moved with quiet, practiced urgency, retrieving whiskey for sterilization and a sewing kit from her satchel. The air grew thick with the smell of medicinal spirits and sweat. She cleaned the wound with steady hand, Caleb groaning low, his resistance spent. It was the first time she had been this close to him, and the first time he had been entirely helpless in her presence. As she began the difficult, intimate process of stitching the torn flesh, their hands, her small, determined ones and his massive, scarred ones, were involuntarily joined by the work. The touch was purely clinical, yet intensely personal, a silent acknowledgement of the fragility of life. She had a clear view of his skin, sun-leathered, rope-burned, a road map of brutal effort. She saw the lines of sorrow that etched his forehead, the indelible bruises left not by fighting, but by a consuming, lonely grief. He didn't speak until she was cutting the thread. "The pines," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "My wife, she loved the way they sighed at night." It was an accidental confession, a memory pushed out by pain, confirming the truth she already knew. His isolation was a consequence of deep loss. She finished the knot, tying off the stitch that bound his flesh together. It felt like she was binding something else, too, a tiny, fragile filament between them. She wrapped the wound, a clean, professional bandage applied with a final, lingering pressure that was intended only to check the gauze, yet conveyed a rush of protective pity. He slowly pulled himself upright, his massive frame supported by the table edge. He looked at her, not at her face, but at her injured hand, the one she had cut herself hours ago and hastily wrapped. Without a word, he reached out, his movement slow but deliberate. He unwrapped the dirty rag from her own cut, ignoring her startled gasp. He retrieved the iodine and clean linen, and with the same profound focus he had used on his own wound, he meticulously cleaned and dressed her hand. His actions were slow, gentle, and utterly silent. A massive man attending to a small injury with exquisite care. When he finished, he didn't release her hand immediately. He simply held it, his thumb resting gently on the back of her palm. It was a lover's touch. It was an act of profound, shared humanity, an acknowledgement that she was no longer just a cook. He was accepting her into the circle of what needed protection. He stood, his decision starkly announced. He moved away from the kitchen counter and, for the first time since her arrival, walked straight to the covered plate she had left on the dining table. He pulled out a chair, the scraping sound echoing in the silence, and sat down, facing the emptiness of the huge room, but accepting the comfort of a meal eaten with intention. His silent gesture said everything. He had been seen, and he had seen her. The long, cold night was beginning to break. The silent compact struck between Jessamine and Caleb at the end of that stitched-up night changed the air in the ranch house, replacing brittle tension with a heavy, unspoken potential. Their interactions remained infrequent and often grim. Yet every glance, every shared moment of labor, now carried the freight of the care exchanged by lamplight. Caleb had allowed her into the fragile circle of his physical needs. She, in turn, found a fierce, proprietorial investment in the house and the land that sheltered them. She was no longer just a hired help. She was the architect of the ranch's only surviving comfort. The kitchen became her arsenal, its rhythmic demands, the kneading, the simmering, the sharpening of knives, a steadying mantra against the mounting peril outside. The peril arrived swiftly, shattering the fragile domestic truce. The next week, the rattlesnake gang ceased their subtle signaling and moved to overt aggression. A midnight raid targeted the small, vital tack barn. The sound of splintering wood and the frantic bleating of horses tore Jessamine from her uneasy sleep. Caleb, already awake and armed, moved with the terrible efficiency of a man long accustomed to fighting ghosts and enemies in the dark. Jessamine, however, refused to cower. She grabbed the antiquated shotgun, the heavy, cold steel of shock against her cheek, and positioned herself at a rear window, becoming an unexpected second line of defense. The ensuing skirmish was brief but brutal, a ragged exchange of gunfire that ended with the gang retreating into the thorny chaparral, taking nothing but leaving behind the indelible smell of cordite and raw, throbbing bruise of fear. The aftermath introduced the first of their crucial cycles of danger and comfort. Caleb returned to the house, his arm useless from a rifle but impact, his face a mask of furious exhaustion. He wasn't wounded by lead, but by the psychic toll of endless defense. Jessamine didn't ask questions. She simply commanded. She forced him to sit, gently worked a soothing balm into the swelling, and prepared a potent bitter tea. While tending him, she found a moment to finally address the carving on the cottonwood. "They want the land, don't they? It's not just cattle." Caleb confirmed it with a curt, weary nod. He spoke of the gang leader, Gideon, a man with a venomous ambition to carve out a local empire from Caleb's acreage. He admitted his long, grief-stricken solitude had made him careless, an easy target. In the ensuing quiet days, a subtle partnership of solitude emerged. Caleb, accepting her competence, began leaving her small, almost imperceptible gifts, a perfect, smooth river stone on the kitchen sill, a bundle of wildflowers thrust awkwardly into a chipped ceramic jug. These were not declarations of love, but acts of humble acknowledgement, the silent language of a frontier man who had forgotten how to speak of tenderness. Jessamine's reply was equally subtle. She made sure his favorite, warm wool blanket, was always placed by the hearth on cold mornings. She started leaving his coffee cup warming by the embers exactly half an hour before dawn. It was a constant, unspoken exchange of watchful care. She was mending not just the house, but the tattered edges of his routine. Their isolation began to feel less like a punishment and more like a necessary crucible. They found themselves sharing meals at the dining table more regularly now, not side by side as before, but across from each other. Silence was still their primary language, yet it was a silence woven with increasing curiosity. One evening, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows, Jessamine finally allowed a small sliver of her carefully guarded past the surface. It wasn't a tragedy, she explained, but a slow, crushing betrayal by a relative, a loss of dignity that had driven her across half a continent, seeking a place where no one knew her name. Caleb listened intently, his gaze heavy. In return, he offered a deeper layer of his own pain. He spoke softly of his deceased wife, not the fever that took her, but the small, vivid details of her life. Her passion for the ranch, her laughter that used to fill the vast, empty rooms. He confessed that after her death, he had deliberately driven people away, believing he was saving them from the contagious malignancy of his own despair. "I didn't want anyone else to become a ghost here," he admitted, his voice raw. Jessamine's heart seized with pity, a powerful, protective instinct that was entirely new. She reached across the table, covering his rough hand with her own. The touch was not tentative. It was an anchor. The atmosphere of shared vulnerability brought a reckless, dangerous relief. But the outside world was closing in. One afternoon, riding the perimeter, Caleb and his men discovered that the rattlesnake gang had begun poisoning the few perennial water sources on the ranch's north end. This was no longer rustling. This was a calculated attempt at extermination. Caleb returned, his face a grim fury, the sheer weight of the impending fight crushing his remaining hope. "It's over, Jessamine," he declared that evening, the words falling like lead weights in the tense stillness of the kitchen. "I'm going to sell the place. I can't protect this land, and I won't risk another life for it." His confession struck her with the force of a physical blow. The thought of losing the sanctuary, of seeing this quiet, resilient man abandon the only thing he had left, filled her with a terrifying, absolute clarity. Her need for a home had eclipsed her need for escape. She rose from her chair, her voice suddenly sharp and commanding, a tone he had never heard. "You fool! You fight this land every single day. You fight the weather, the drought, and the solitude. You let a pack of vermin chase you off the only ground worth fighting for." She slammed her palm onto the table, the sharp report echoing the depth of her unexpected rage. "I won't let you." Her fury was magnificent, fueled by the desperate, blooming tenderness she felt for him, for his ghost, and for their shared future. Caleb was stunned into silence, his tired eyes widening at the intensity of her defense. He hadn't seen himself through her eyes, as a man worthy of such ferocious loyalty. He crossed the short space between them, his gaze direct and piercing. He didn't argue. He didn't touch her. Instead, he made a final, powerful counteroffer, a leap of faith born of desperation and nascent love. "Then help me fight them, Jessamine." "Truly fight them," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly. "Stay with me, not just as a cook, but as my partner." He paused, his breath ragged. "If you won't leave, then promise me that tonight we stop being two people waiting to be rescued and start being one thing that can't be broken." The implicit promise, the profound gravity of his appeal, hung heavy in the warm, herb-scented air. Jessamine looked into his dark, searching eyes, seeing the raw vulnerability behind the rancher's stoicism. The prospect was terrifying, a full, complete surrender to the guarded life she had clung to. Yet the choice was simple: return to the cold loneliness of the road, or embrace the incandescent danger and protective warmth of his love. With a shaky intake of breath, she gave him a single, resolute nod. "I'll stay," she confirmed, the word not a submission, but a declaration of war on his enemies and on her own solitude. The shared vigil that followed Jessamine's declaration was not one of frightened waiting, but a methodical preparation. The unspoken promise made in the quiet kitchen had forged them into a unit, two disparate souls unified by the immediate, devastating threat to their sanctuary. Caleb, though still stiff with pain, moved with renewed purpose, driven by a loyalty he hadn't deserved and a future he hadn't thought possible. He distributed the meager armaments, instructing the few remaining hands on their defensive positions around the vital points: the main well, the stone corrals, and the hay store. Jessamine, refusing to be relegated to the pantry, demanded the vantage point of the attic window, the one position that overlooked the long, desolate approach road. She cleaned and loaded her shotgun, the weight of the steel a grim comfort, and stockpiled bandages and whiskey, transforming the quiet house into a field infirmary. The reckoning came not at dawn, but in the brutal, slanting light of mid-morning. A column of dust rose on the horizon, swelling quickly into the form of a dozen riders. The entire Rattlesnake gang, led by the merciless Gideon. Their approach was arrogant and unhurried, a deliberate display of overwhelming force designed to crush resistance before it began. Caleb watched from the cover of the barn, his gaze fixed and cold. "They think we're broken," he muttered, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. "They'll be surprised by what Jessamine has built here." The gunfight began with a sudden, deafening salvo as the first wave of riders breached the perimeter. The air immediately became a chaotic, shrieking tear of lead and dust. From her perch, Jessamine became the ranch's unblinking eye. She was precise, not reckless. Her first shot, a blast of buckshot, struck a man attempting to flank the corral, forcing the gang to pull back into the sparse cover of the scrub oaks. The sound of the gunfire was relentless, a percussive, primal symphony of survival. She reloaded with swift, desperate dexterity, the acrid smell of gunpowder billowing up to her. Every shot she fired was a deliberate defense of the life Caleb had allowed her to share. Below, Caleb and his men fought with the tenacious fury of the doomed. The gang, frustrated by the unexpected organization of the defense, shifted their assault, focusing their main attack on the sturdy but aging barn, believing they could flush Caleb out. The fight became a brutal, close-quarters slugging match, the men exchanging fire across bales of hay and splintered timber. The danger intensified sharply when Caleb took a hit, not a bullet, but a glancing blow to the head that sent him staggering, his vision momentarily eclipsed by the shock. Gideon, seeing his opportunity, abandoned his horse and sprinted into the barn, his rifle raised. He was a brute of a man, his eyes alight with cruel, conquering malice. He had come for the land and the visceral pleasure of destroying the man who owned it. Caleb, disoriented and struggling to lift his weapon, was completely exposed. From the attic window, Jessamine saw the whole agonizing tableau. The gang leader poised above Caleb, aiming for the killing shot. All her preparations, all her courage, the fragile hope she had dared to build, it was about to be obliterated. She realized, with a sickening lurch, that she couldn't get a clear line of fire without hitting Caleb. She abandoned the window, sprinting down the dusty, echoing stairs, the shotgun useless in this confined chaos. She burst into the kitchen, her mind scrambling for a weapon, a final, desperate instrument of defense. Her eyes locked on the heavy, blackened cast-iron skillet resting on the stove, the one she used every morning to cook breakfast for the crew. She burst into the barn just as Gideon was steadying his aim. With a strangled cry of pure, protective rage, she launched the skillet like a primitive projectile. It flew through the smoky air, a heavy, blunt messenger of domestic vengeance, striking Gideon squarely on the side of the head with a sickening clang. The impact was immediate and absolute. The gang leader crumpled, his rifle skittering away into the dirt. The battlefield fell into an unnerving, sudden silence. Caleb, seizing the fraction of time she bought him, scrambled back to his feet, dazed but operational. He quickly disarmed the stunned Gideon and, with a vicious efficiency born of his own deep pain, knocked the man unconscious. Seeing their leader incapacitated, the remaining riders of the Rattlesnake Gang lost their will to fight. They broke ranks, abandoning their wounded and fleeing into the unforgiving horizon. The reckoning was complete. The ranch was safe, bought with blood, steel, and a cast-iron skillet. The aftermath was a blur of exhausting relief. The wounds were tended, the dead were buried, and the few remaining ranch hands secured the prisoners for the circuit judge. By the time the low sun cast long, peaceful shadows through the kitchen window, Jessamine and Caleb were the only two left standing. She was utterly spent, a tremor running through her hands, the smell of smoke clinging to her hair. Caleb found her sitting on the floor by the cold stove, simply breathing. He was cleaned up, his forehead bandaged, his exhaustion visible in the way he carried his massive frame. He didn't speak of the battle. He spoke of the future. He pulled out a kitchen chair, sat beside her, and reached out, taking her hands, the same ones he had so tenderly bandaged days before. "I won't sell, Jessamine," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I won't ever leave this land, because now you're here. You gave my house life, and you gave me back the reason to live in it." He looked at her, and the profound, dark sorrow in his eyes was finally replaced by a fragile light. "I don't know how to do this thing between a man and a woman, after so long, after the loss. But I know I love you, and I know I want you here, always." His confession, humble and honest, was a final dismantling of the wall around her own heart. She had fled east to avoid being seen. Now, she realized she had found a man who not only saw her, but cherished the fierce, survivalist core beneath her practical exterior. "I love you, Caleb," she whispered, the words trembling slightly. "But this, the rest of it, I've never—" Her voice trailed off, overcome by the magnitude of the commitment and her own profound vulnerability, a feeling more terrifying than the gunfight. He rose slowly and led her, not to the kitchen table, but through the dark, echoing rooms and up the wide staircase to his bedroom. The room was simple, dominated by a large, heavy bed and the sound of the whispering pines just outside the window. The air was cool and clean. He stood before her, a great, solid form of tenderness and strength, waiting for her to come to him. She reached up, her small hands moving tentatively to his shirt. The feel of his warm, solid chest beneath the rough cotton was overwhelming. The fear was a living thing, a coil of doubt and inexperience tightening in her chest. She had survived a wild, brutal world by being guarded. Now, she had to surrender completely to trust. He moved to pull her closer, but she stopped him, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up at his face, her eyes wide and wet with the magnitude of the moment, the sealing of their hard-won love, the ultimate triumph over her solitary past. She finally articulated her deepest fear, the words coming out in a rush of terrified honesty, a confession of vulnerability that surpassed all the bullets and threats of the day. Jessamine held his scarred, calloused hand, her voice barely a breath. "Slide it in slowly. It's my first time and you are too big." Caleb's eyes closed momentarily, absorbing the shattering weight of her trust. This woman, who had faced down a gang of murderers with a skillet, was giving him her final, most precious possession. He handled her with an exquisite, protective care that defied his rough exterior, his movements deliberate, gentle, and utterly focused on her comfort. The union was slow, deliberate, a powerful, tender sealing of their bond, the final vanquishing of their ghosts, and the beautiful, gritty start to a life forged in fire. Asterisk and so, friends, that's the true West, isn't it? A place where you arrive looking for nothing more than a kitchen to hide in, only to find a heart vast enough to hold all your fear and all your future. Jessamine came with a satchel and a secret. She stayed for a man who learned that the greatest battle isn't holding on to land, but holding on to the courage to love again. Caleb was alone out here, guarding a graveyard, but it took one determined cook to bring the scent of life back to the pines. That's the way love works out here, earned in the dust, sealed with bullet, and forever bound by an impossible tenderness. Asterisk if a story of resilience and hard-won love like this warms your own solitary heart. Don't let the fire die out. There are 1,000 more secrets waiting out here on the trail, and I'm just waiting for you to listen. Asterisk. The quiet that settled over whispering pines was not the dead silence of solitude, but a profound, resonant peace, the sound of two hearts finally beating in unison. The emotional surrender of that harrowing night had fused Jessamine and Caleb into an inseparable unit. They spent the next weeks mending the physical wounds of the ranch, replacing shattered windows, clearing spent shells, their joint labor a constant, tacit confirmation of their commitment. The smell of cordite gave way entirely to the clean, bracing scent of pine and freshly turned soil. Caleb, though still rugged, was transformed. His gaze, once distant, was now perpetually watchful and filled with a bewildered tenderness. He moved around Jessamine with protective care, treating her as the fragile, vital source of life she had become. He finally broke down the high, lonely walls he had maintained, asking her opinion on every decision, acknowledging her as the absolute mistress of the ranch. As the months accumulated, the evidence of their shared life became undeniable. Jessamine's practical dresses began to stretch gently over her growing form. The fear that had once fueled her desperate need for escape was utterly replaced by the steady, quiet joy of expectation. She found herself habitually resting her hand on her abdomen, feeling the small, insistent movements within, a constant, warm confirmation that she was no longer just surviving. She was creating. By the time the calendar turned, marking nearly 8 months since the reckoning, the ranch felt ready. The cradle Caleb had built years ago for his first child, once a painful relic, was painstakingly restored and placed by the warmest window. The arrival came on a wild, tempestuous night, the wind whipping the pines into a frenzy that mirrored the fierce pain and exhausting effort within the house. Caleb, massive and powerful, was reduced to a nervous wreck, utterly helpless as Jessamine labored with a primal strength. He had only seen her direct at rustlers. Then, just as the storm broke and the first hesitant rays of dawn filtered through the window, the triumphant sound of a newborn cry filled the room. It was a girl, Caleb, tears tracing clean paths through the dust of fatigue on his cheeks, held his breath as a small, perfect being was placed in Jessamine's arms. The baby, swaddled in soft linen, had her mother's determined chin and her father's startlingly dark, penetrating eyes. Jessamine looked up at Caleb, her face exhausted but radiating an incandescent joy. "Our second chance," she whispered, her voice rough with exhaustion. "Welcome home, little one." Caleb knelt beside the bed, placing his massive, callous hand gently on his daughter's head, the roughness of his skin contrasting with the baby's silken softness. He had gone west running from death and loneliness. He found a cook who taught him about life and love, and in return, she gave him a legacy, a beautiful, tiny frontier girl who would never know the isolation that had once nearly destroyed him. The whispering pines were quiet now, whispering only a profound and enduring peace.